I said take a little bite. I didn't think we had the whole thing.
Okay. Okay. So welcome again and good evening. Today we are going to be focusing on the design, the pre-work that you need to do actually in the process of trying to design an app. That will be the focus of our class today. So I'm going to be walking us through that process, and I'll be very happy if it's actually interactive, if you can ask any questions, and as we walk through the entire process. So let me permit me to go ahead and share my screen again. So I want to think that you can see my screen right now. So I kind of entitled this designing a user experience, because at the end of the day, what you actually want to design is an experience for the user. So one of the things to pay attention to is that design is is not just how a product looks or feels, because that's what people tend to, and I'm going to be borrowing some of the ideas from the readings you have done if you've already done the readings around this, right? Design is not just about how a product looks or feels. How it works is also very important. So when you think of an app, there are two main things that you're talking about, right? You're talking about functionality, which is, does it really do the work that it was designed, that you had in mind, right, for creating the app? Then the second part would be, is it flexible enough, right, for people to be able to navigate through? And does it look and feel great? There have been instances where people literally just go on a website and they're looking for information, and it's like a rabbit hole. You really can't find what you're looking for, and in such cases, sometimes people have to go to the site map and begin to do searches. And once you get to a point where you have to go to this site map to begin to do searches to find information, just know that that site is probably not well designed. It should be so designed that once you get in there, you are able to somehow navigate to the information that you're looking at. So in designing an app, it's important to pay attention not just to aesthetics, the looks and the feel, but it's also important to focus on usability, right? Whether it functions, it solves the core problem for which you are designing the app. So part of getting that to happen is actually about the data that you collect and how you are able to, how your program is able to interact with that data and organize that data, right? That's part of the process of you developing an app. Now, but with the issue of data, right, you also begin to run into some problems, some of which were discussed in the course book. And one of those problems you run into is the issue of bias, right? So as developers or would-be developers, it's important that you also pay attention to the kind of data that you gather and how you use that data, because um, in computer science, right, one of the earliest concepts I got familiar was the issue of garbage in, garbage out, right? That whatever you put in a computer, the job of a computer is just to amplify. So from the very first class in unit one, right, we talked about how everything you do around programming is literally about putting in data at one end and getting some kind of data at the as an output, right? The only difference is that that data has been modified by the algorithm or by some machine within your application to give you some organized outcome in the form of information, at the other end. So that means if you give if you put into your app, right, garbage data, it's going to give you garbage results. So one of those big challenges is therefore how you collect your data. It's not the subject of our discussion here. I think I've taught an artificial intelligence class where that was a major focus of the class, but it's just something that you need to pay attention. In this class there wasn't a lot of focus around issues of bias in data, but uh, in one of the things that tends to happen when you have you have certain kinds of data, right, that is not representative. So it's about representation. So you want to be able to use representative data. And what do I mean by representative data? Like if you are designing, say, you're building an app for kids and adults, right? Or you are building an app that people within every age group would use, you want to be able to collect data that transcends um, the boundary of the ages of the people you're designing for. So if it's, say, for teenagers to people that are in their 90s, you want to be able to collect data from one point to the other. If you just go collect data from, say, the teenagers, right, and you're building that data is definitely going to be biased against those that are outside there, so that it doesn't give you the kind of results that you would want. So in building a lot of apps and applications, right? For example, for facial recognition, right? So for some folks building facial recognition apps, we've had scenarios where people are building these apps, but most of the people, they actually collect data from our fair, right? And then what happens is, for people that have darker skin, it gives you like really, really very wrong results. Same thing happens with language when it comes to accent, right? If you're building a language translation app, you want to be able to make sure that the data you're collecting to be able to build that app is also representative. I think in the second course that follows this, there will be a lot of emphasis on data. There are also issues around hiring apps or algorithms, criminal justice, credit scoring, and all of that. That's something that has happened. The purpose of this is just to be able to have us pay attention to that. One of those specific examples is in car safety. You know how they use dummies to test for the safety of cars. What has happened is, over a very long time, there has been a focus where a lot of the data that has been used for doing those car safety tests, right, have been data of males, right? And that has informed how most cars have been designed. So what tends to happen is, in some cases, if you have accidents happen, right, the survivability of males is actually higher than, say, kids or women within those cars. And the reason why that's happening is because most of those models and even the designs of those cars has been based around data collected with males. And you see a lot of dummies that are also used. You find out they are male dummies, and this therefore doesn't take into cognizance the variation in the physique, for example, of males and females. So when you want to use data, you want to make sure that the data you are collecting, that you're going to be using for building your app, is actually representative of the population that you're trying to reach. So one of the things you're going to see in the design course that we are working that we're going through right now, is that there is a heavy emphasis on the end users, right? You can't have a successful, you can design anything successfully, but when it comes to usability, when it comes to the function and the value that it provides to the people that you're designing for, you're going to fail on that count. Which is why, as we go through this, it's important to pay attention to the fact, if there's anything you take out of the class today, is the place of your end user. you know I would say generally the place of your stakeholders, but particularly this place of the end user. So um, often when you want to design an app, some of the things you want to take into cognizance, right, are things like, you know, um, the purpose of the app. What exactly do you want to achieve with the app? What are you trying to do? So for I'll use apps like Uber and maybe the other sister apps like Lyft, right? For example, what was the purpose of their app, right? Um, the companies or the founders at the time realized that there was some friction in the market, right? And what was the problem? You had taxis, and these taxis will come pick people up, right? And sometimes you are in a new city, you don't even have the phone numbers of these apps. You have to start looking for the phone numbers, and then you have to call them, and then you have to have them understand where you are. So the whole idea of Uber and Lyft and associated apps was to be able to provide a seamless and painless experience for the rider, the taxi rider. That was so it was clear what their purpose was. But then just having that overarching purpose doesn't really address everything, and that's why we are doing this class where I'm going to walk us through a formal process through which some organizations actually tease out what the problem is in the marketplace. Once you have those frictions, right, those frictions create pain points for the end user. And what businesses do, and what people that create apps, for example, do, is they identify those gaps in the market or those frictions that users experience, and then go one step further to identify the pain points of the users. And you do that by interacting with the users, getting information, or again data from the users, right? So if you talk to enough people, right, that are going through that experience, chances are that you will be able to extract enough data to be able to understand what their pain points are, and then you can ultimately work with them to create solutions to alleviate those pain points. And usually these processes happen in a very iterative manner. So uh, in other words, once you have the purpose of the app, you're able to now identify the audience, which is what I was talking about, which is the audience in this case is the end user, right? And then you are able to figure out what their needs are. And then once you figured out what the needs of the end user is, you want to now identify the core functions of the app. Now we're talking about solutions that would be able to address the needs in the step before it. And then it's from once you're able to sort out the issues of functionality, um, now the end user needs to be able to interact with those functions in a seamless way. And that's where the issue of your user interface comes in. Only at that point would you begin to plan your user interface and how you can create a navigation experience, an interface experience that would be painless and smooth for the user. And then the other thing you want to do is, often there are development constraints. So Uber, again, for example, now when Uber is trying to develop this whole thing, of course they are going to begin to, or Airbnb, for example, like how do you allow a total stranger to come into your house, right? Is there a way we can positively identify these strangers so that whoever I'm going to use their house, right, for the rental is going to be comfortable with that user? So those are a whole lot of constraints. And then you also have like the technical constraints. All of those things are things you want to think about before you even begin to go through the whole process of your app. Now, there's something a couple of, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, I worked with IBM in their enterprise design thinking course. So design thinking is one of those would I call them frameworks, that exist. And design thinking has existed maybe for 20, 30 years or more. I can't be sure of how long it's existed, but it's now MIT teaches. I think MIT teaches design thinking, and different companies have their version of design thinking. The specific version for IBM is called Enterprise Design Thinking. If it's something you're interested in, you can actually go to YouTube. There are a lot of videos around design thinking. But design thinking is a design philosophy that actually requires you to work with other people, right? And more importantly, with several stakeholders, and more importantly, with the user of whatever product you're trying to develop, so that at the end of the day, you can tease out all the details, that a lot of the details that we talked about, you know, uh, for the specs, or some of the things you need to identify for this app. So design thinking is it's both a set of philosophies and a set of tools for actually extracting all of that information, for ideating, for creating prototypes, and eventually testing those prototypes, right? And making sure that you've been able to identify the pain points of the customer, worked with them to come up with a bunch of solutions to solve those problems, and then created prototypes, and then tested those prototypes over and over again until we are satisfied, or we are sure that that prototype is actually going to solve the problem of the friction in the market. So once you have done all of this, it's only after you've gone through these processes that you can now say, hey, let's sit down and let's start coding. So this is, so for some people, they were like, oh, this is time wasting. Frankly, at the end of the day, it might take a whole time, take like some of these processes can take you a whole day from morning till evening working with your team to ideate, to identify problems. Sometimes it could take you weeks, it could take you months. But the good thing is, once you're done with it, now you have a blueprint of what you're going to code. If you do it the other way around, frankly, you can literally get bogged down. You run into all kinds of problems, and there is evidence all over the place around what I'm talking about right now. So now, most design thinking programs, right, are designed around these five items. Empathize, and I'm going to discuss each of the items. You empathize, you define, you ideate, you create prototypes, and then you test. Now, this is not necessarily, in a sense, this is linear, but it's not necessarily stuck in linear, right? It's an iterative process. It's an iterative process where you can loop through different steps in the process, and that's why if you talk to people that do design thinking, it's for those of you that are familiar with some of the paradigms in project management, you don't use waterfall, you actually use agile for design thinking, because it's not a stepwise process. You can loop back and forth between each of them because it's essentially designed around iterations. So empathize, which is one of those first steps, right? This is literally the process of getting to know the end user and the problems they face, right? And there are any number of ways you can do that, right? One of the ways you can do, and this is a very limited version of how you can go about doing some of these tools are some of the tools that are involved, say, in the IBM design thinking, enterprise design thinking, some of the recommended tools. There are several other tools, and if you are going to be working with, say, the MIT model, you probably will have a different set of tools. I just speak of the IBM model because it's something I'm familiar with. I'm certified in, and I also have taught groups and classes and organizations, um, in. So these are some of the issues. So getting to know the end user and the problems they face, and then understanding their emotional and psychological needs. Now, you're going deeper into understanding what is it that makes them cry, like what are the pain points they have, right? So using our Uber example, which I've elected to be my use case today, right? What some of those users would have, founders would have done is they would have seen, in fact, there is a personal story one of those users talked about, right? Because initially the goal of creating Uber wasn't, to create a business. It was actually to solve a problem, a very small problem, but then it just ended up, expanding, right? So it's that whole thing of, identifying a problem, like how can I literally, um you know get a ride when I need it, you know so how can I, within the comfort of my phone house, not begin to look for a phone number? Once I have the app, I am able to call the app. Now, in the old days of traditional taxis, once you call a taxi company, you could sit there for 20 minutes, 30 minutes. You don't even know if the company is coming. Sometimes you call back the company and they tell you, hey, the taxi is on its way. You have no idea. So Uber comes around and they build in a map, and you can actually literally track the vehicles and see. So that way you're not restless. That way you can tell if there's a problem, so that you can pivot. Now, one of the things I enjoy most about riding Uber, especially when I'm late for a flight, is just getting to the airport, jumping out of the car. In those other days, guess what? You need to look for cash, and then you need to look for change, and you have to, tell them, hey, just keep that change because nobody has change. Or you want to start fiddling with your, your card, you know, and you so but right now, once an Uber drops you off at an airport, you just jump off and you're out. The company deals with all of that. So all of those frictions, those pain points of customers have been taken away. So when you're in the process of developing your own app, or for those of you that will go on at some point to work for companies, you very likely will be involved in the design thinking process, where you want to do, you have to do interviews, you have to do surveys. Sometimes you want to actually bring in typical users, and discuss with them. And then there are things they call mind mapping. They have the empathy map and all of that. So I think this is an example of the as is scenario map, where, for example, you're trying to find out what is it that this customer. So how design thinking works is you actually literally paste all of these white papers on the wall, and then you have a bunch of people that are going to be working with you there, and then you can actually put them in groups, and each of them. So we are thinking of, say, this is not a typical example for, say, the taxi, for for the taxi customer, but this is just tracking a typical day. How you plan, you depart, you do your transit, you park, and you arrive. Think of it like someone that actually has a car, right? And this is their journey in the day, from leaving the house, you know, and arriving wherever they are. They have to do the parking and everything. So these are the three main things you want to ask yourself. What is this user going to be thinking when they are doing this? What are they thinking at, during the planning stage? Let's say there are no maps, like our Google map, or what do you call it, like your GPS, right? And they had to go plan their trip, right? are they thinking at that particular time? While in the planning stage, what are they doing? Like, what are they feeling? Because that's why I told you about the psychological, because you have to enter into the world of your user to understand exactly what it is going on with that person. So sometimes, right, what you actually do in this process is to look for have the person come there, right, and interview them and then put down the information they are giving to you, or you can create a representation of that person. So for example, if you're designing something for a typical college student, you want to say, give that typical college student a name. Let's say the name is Luke, and then you put a silhouette or a picture of something that represents Luke, and you decide on the age of Luke, you decide on the social status of Luke, where Luke could have come from. Does he come from the country, or does he come from the city? All of those information around Luke are really very relevant in designing this app. So when they depart, when they transit, right, when they are looking for parking, what are they thinking at that point? What are they doing? What are they feeling? Those are all of the things that would form part of. That's why we call it empathize, because you want to be able to go into the shoe of the user to understand what is going on in their mind, in their thoughts. What happens when they run into these problems that we are trying to solve? You want to be able to capture all of that. And the best and easiest way is to actually be talking to the end user. You know, do focus groups, right, where you get people that are representative of that situation, discuss with them and talk to them, and that's how you gather all of that information. Now, once you've gathered all of that information, the next thing you want to do is to define the user's need based on, you already have the knowledge of what their problems are at a very intimate level. You want to, now define that need. Because when you go back here, right, what tends to happen is eventually different people that are working on these are going to have different things they think this guy is thinking. Now, after this, the process, you actually begin to take each of these post-it and begin to categorize them, put them in different groups, right? Before you know what's happening, you're actually going to see different clusters, right? That would give you subgroups of what's happening to this guy or to this lady or to this particular user. And from that information, that's where you are actually able to articulate what their specific needs are. Sometimes there are actually times when the users tells you things what that they think is the problem, but after you've gone through this process with them, you actually realize that what they think is their problem is actually not what the problem is. They would have actually given you that problem, you know, without telling you that that's what the problem is. But then there are all of these hidden details that are in the data that they have given you. And that's how you are able to articulate. Now, you might end up with maybe 10 different problems, right? And narrow it down to three, or the three most important problems, you know. And for example, like the Uber app, I just mentioned some of those typical problems, right? Is how do I get a ride? How do I track that um, ride to make sure that it's going to get to me in 7 minutes, because I have a flight to catch at this particular point. It tells you exactly when you're going to get to the airport and all of that. So that was a problem. How am I going to pay for this in a very frictionless manner? Those are all the problems that you can now, the definition process helps you articulate. Now, once that is done, you want to be able to create a problem statement, which is literally writing one simple or complex sentence, right, that articulates what the problem of, because if you can't summarize it, if you can't write it out, and it should be written in such a way that if you gave it to a 5-year-old, right, they would understand what the problem is, right? So, what are some of the tools, right? One of those is storyboarding. And what literally storyboarding has to do with is, you know, creating like pictorial diagrams of almost what you have here, but more in a pictorial form to actually see whether those problems that you have identified are what they are assumed to be. It's almost something like this, right? Now, somebody sees a commercial, downloads an app, sees the commercial, downloads the app, places an order. Now it shows you the estimated time for the pickup. You drive to the restaurant because it tells you when you're supposed to pick up. You complete some survey and you get your food. So that's the process of getting this food, right? You want to be able to list all of those processes, because as you list some of those processes, that's when you begin to identify those problems that have been articulated, those needs that have been articulated, and that's how you're able to clarify what your problem statement is. Personas, which is literally what I was also talking about, right? You want to be able to look at the specific, sometimes you're trying to solve a problem, right? And you have different people for which that problem has to be solved. Sometimes you want to create representative elements of each of those people and identify what those problems are. There are in several other tools that are there, but like in this case, right, you want to make sure you scope, right? Once you have identified what the issues are here, right, what your goal here is to be able to narrow down, like I was mentioning, it could be 10 different problems, but narrow down what are the top 3 problems, and don't go off on a rabbit hole trying to solve all these other problems. The second thing, that's a problem in this process is sometimes people do not focus on the user. So I want to say this: never be presumptuous. Never think you know the user. Always ask. Always ask. That's why this process is a very user-centric process, or else you're going to end up creating an app. You spend $10,000, hundreds of hours creating an app, and nobody is using it, or it doesn't really solve any problem for anyone. And that's why you see some apps people just don't, because it doesn't solve the problem of the people that would use it. In your mind, right, you actually think you've created this awesome thing, but it doesn't resonate with the representative group. So the other thing to point out before I proceed to the next step is that the point of this whole process is to identify the pain points of the customer and to respond to existing friction in the marketplace, right? Because once you're able to identify those frictions and now go down beyond the frictions to identify the pain points of the people, just like I talked about in the Uber and the Lyft cases, where their issue was, how do I hail the app? How do we seamlessly make these payments, especially when you are in a hurry? That's the whole point of the design thinking process. So the third step is, once you've extracted all of this information from your user, and then you've created identified the top problems, and then you've created a problem statement that is very clear to everyone, to yourself, to your team, and everybody. The next thing is begin to ask yourself, right? How can I solve this problem or these problems? So what kind of solutions can solve these problems? I'm telling you, sometimes at this stage, right, will be the end of your project, but because you now realize it's actually not an app that can solve this problem. But if it is an app, so what kind of app will solve this problem? And those are the kind of things you want to do. you know and when usually, if you're working with a team, that's when you begin to have a brainstorming session. Or if you're just the only one, you can literally do a context map, right? Which is where, for example, you draw a cycle and use arrows to draw other circles that have relationship to that circle, and then use another arrow to create associations, because the whole idea is to pour down everything, right, that you have, right? So and a brainstorming session helps you do that. Like the mind mapping using a context map that I just mentioned is one way of doing it. You can also be doing all kinds of sketches. Eventually, one of the very important things is there's nothing like a bad idea at this stage. Whatever it is, never allow anyone criticize anybody irrespective of what they say, because there have been fabulous ideas that came from what seemed to be a dumb idea in the first place. And it wasn't because that dumb idea, quote and unquote, eventually came up with something. It was either just an association someone made with some other idea to the dumb idea that all of a sudden gave the fabulous idea. So at this stage, it's not a time to criticize. It's not a time to say, oh, there are no resources to do this. Not nada. It's a time where everybody comes up with their ideas, and usually you use these post-its, and everybody writes the ideas. Everybody is quiet. You turn off your phones and all of that, right? And then you sketch things, try to figure out things. It's just an ideation process, bringing out all of the ideas. And then once you get these ideas, you want to now begin to cluster these ideas, right? Because one of the things, I've done this long enough to see that almost every time you all of a sudden will begin to see patterns that you could never have thought about, right? Because all of these people, right, come up with all these ideas. Some of them are really very similar, and then you put them together, and before you know what's happening, you're having some really important things, to place in mind when you're in an ideation process is to defer judgment. Like I said, no limits, no bounds, let people just flow in their ideas, no bad ideas. You also want to think outside the box. Just because it's not been done before doesn't mean that it can be done. Comes back to no bad ideas. Now, the problem, the other thing is you want to make sure you have a diverse team. You want to, because there's a magic with a diverse team, and not just, it doesn't have to just be diversity in terms of race, for example. It doesn't have to be, it also has to be diversity in terms of experience. And it also has to be diversity in terms of um, like your work roles. So for example, if you're doing a design thinking session, you want to make sure that the coder is there, the guy that writes the code. You want to make sure that the UI UX guy, right, is there. You want to make sure that the user or someone that represents the user is there. You want to make sure that the project manager, right, or your, what do you call, your project management person is there. Everybody needs to be there, right? Because all of a sudden some people are going to tell you, hey, when you begin to look at it, this is a better way to do it. This is because they've had an experience in that area. So ideation is a very awesome process, because that's when you tease out the many solutions to that problem. Before now, you never talk about solutions. You focus on identifying the problems. It's only after you've done this that we now go to the next process, right? Which is prototyping. And prototyping here is used as a very high level word, actually, because there are several other things like below prototyping, but generally it's prototyping. That's why I said it encapsulates most activities directed towards developing a scaled down version of the product. What you want to do at this point is to create a scaled down version of the product. There's a reason why you want to do a scaled down version of the product. And the reason is because you want to make sure you don't want to go so far into the production of this thing, right? And all of a sudden realize that it doesn't work, and it has cost you so much money, and it has cost you so much time. And that's why a lot of engineers and a lot of programmers become very resistant, because of the number of hours and the emotional connection they now have with the products they are trying to develop. And now they become defensive. They don't want to listen to anyone anymore, you know, which is a total recipe for disaster. So what you want to do is to start small. And at every stage in time, you are testing. you're iterating, you're talking to the users, you're having them test out what you're doing, right? So at this stage, what you want to do is to create that prototype. Now, so prototyping could include things like creating wireframes, mock-ups, and actual prototypes. We're going to talk a little. So for within the design community, right? Especially these two, mock-ups and prototypes are used interchangeably. But the truth is that there are some differences. So if you go online or go somewhere and start reading it, reading up things, all of a sudden you're going to see them being used interchangeably sometimes, and then people giving all kinds of definition to them. But for the purposes of this class, I'm going to attempt to show us what we agree in this class as to what a wireframe is, what a mock-up is, and what a prototype is. So, what are the tools you need for your prototyping process? So you need pencil and paper. Obviously, that's like the age-old tool, right? You have to start somewhere. Um, I think sometime I was reading, I think it's in Harvard also, that some of these that actually if you go to Harvard, there's a particular place where they displayed some of the greatest writers, right? The very first draft that they started with for some of the classics that were wrote that they developed. They actually have some of those drafts, stored up in Harvard. People can actually come look at those drafts. You find out some of those drafts were nothing near the final works of a lot of these writers and artists. Why? Because that's where you start. That's not where you end. But it's very important that you start at that place because it gives you room for improvement. Right. So first, pencils and paper. Um, you can use 3D modeling applications to develop 3D models. You can use things like Sketch. Sketch is heavily used by people that develop apps, which is just an application. You can look it up. You have Keynote. Keynote is like Apple's version of your the presentation, it's like their presentation application where probably see that today. And in fact, anything in fact that can help you build something, right? That begins to, that's like a scaled down version of the product you're trying to create, that would qualify as a tool. So when you're in your prototyping phase, one of the things you want to do is you want to avoid complexity, right? Your prototype does not necessarily have to have all the features of your final product, right? It needs to focus in most cases, right, on the functionality of the product, right? That's where the value is, because if you can achieve that functionality, then we can begin to beautify, we can begin to butter up the product, you know. Um, Staying at a level, at a very simple level, right, devoid of complexity, helps you make changes when necessary, right? Because your cost at this point and your input is low. Now, one of those really, really wrong things people do when they are prototyping is excluding the end user. So you end up creating a seat, and you manufacture it, and then the people that you are designing for, they will try to sit in that seat, and all of a sudden, because of their size, they can't fit, or you run into all kinds of ergonomical problems. You don't want to do that. So that's why you want to, when you create the prototype, you have the end users, right? Test it, critique it, tell you what they think about it. That's where one of the important notes. You don't want to exclude the end user, and a no for prototyping is investing too much time and money in a prototype. The idea of the prototype is to help you, have everybody come to the conclusion that what you're doing actually solves the problem and that they are comfortable with it. Sometimes you actually use prototypes to actually get budgets approved to do the main thing, because now everybody is very convinced that this is going to solve the problem. So before I keep harping on and on, does anyone have any questions, contributions, whatever at this stage? Or have you done any work in this area that you might want to share with the team? We'll be very happy to hear you out. Or there's something you don't understand. Uh so Sketch is not, I haven't really looked into Sketch a lot. I don't know whether it's paid for or it's free. And I would assume, I want to think that it might be free. I don't know, I'm not sure. But what is certainly available for us is Keynote, because Keynote is literally it's free, and it's also easy to use and all of that. But I know for sure that there are so many open source applications. If Sketch is not open source and free, there are so many open source applications that are out there that you can use. I can tell you, all you need to do is just Google open source, you know, prototyping tools, and I bet you, I haven't checked, but I bet you there are dozens of them. Okay. Um, so the fifth step in this process is um, test. You want to test the solutions and to make sure that it really works how you want it to work. And we're talking about the prototypes you've created. And then while you're doing that, that's your opportunity to collect feedback from the users and other stakeholders. Now think of companies, right? That's why they do sometimes the beta version, right? And they're giving away these things for free, because Chat GPT, they're giving everybody for free so that you can test it and give them feedback so that they can correct the areas that are really difficult. I mean, I'm sure you have seen products that you tried using and you just don't understand why a certain part of that product is just so difficult. And nobody is asking for your feedback. Nobody has ever asked for your feedback, right? So you don't want to roll out a product until you have tested and tested and tested, giving it to people, identified where the problems are. So, you know, so that at the end of the day you have not a final, because if you're serious about product development, you actually never come to the end of the development of a product, but at least you've come to a place where you're comfortable enough to be able to roll out version 1 of that product. And all of that happens, and guess what, there are some products that come to this stage, the test stage, to die because nobody likes them. It doesn't work out like how we thought it was going to work out. And then after looking at everything, the best judgment is just to have these products end. Now, the benefits of this process is that at least you haven't committed a lot of money and time to the product. So the product dying at this stage, it might be painful, it might be hurtful, it might end up in the team being disbursed, but then at least you haven't spent tons and tons of money. Now, if you're someone that is trying to outsource your app development, at this stage, you haven't even given it to an app developer. In other words, you haven't hired an app developer and had to pay them the tons of money they ask for an hourly. For you too, if you are going to develop your code, which I hope will be the case, in at this stage, you haven't committed your time to writing anything. All you have done is just right. So you have at this stage, sorry, the tools, I didn't list, these tools are not the tools that are supposed to be here. But then for the notes, this is actually being resistant to change is definitely not one of those things you want to do, right? You don't want to be resistant to change. You don't want to be resistant to change at this stage, because remember, you're getting feedback from the users and other stakeholders, so you want to listen to them. You want to be sure what it is they are asking you to do, and following up with those corrections. Now, sometimes you might get feedback that might be harsh, right? Just realize that it's not about you, it's about the product, and you're not creating this product for you, you're creating this product for the end user. And if the end user and or end users and other stakeholders are telling you that there's something wrong with this, best believe, no matter how awesome it looks to you, there's probably something wrong with it. So for some people, they get stuck in it because they are so emotionally invested, they are unable to pivot. That's a red flag. So except you're creating the product just for yourself, if it's just for yourself, it's a pet project, that's beautiful. Something you want to show off, to show your skills, that's beautiful. But if you're designing for the marketplace, you definitely want to be open to change. You definitely want to be willing to pivot. You definitely want to avoid defensiveness. So, next steps. So, at the end of the day, what you want to do is to create a semi-realistic user experience. That's what happens with all of this prototyping that you're doing. You want to be able to create some kind of semi-user experience, semi-realistic user experience. And then you can build a working prototype, particularly for the apps that we are talking about in Keynote, right? Where you include links and animations to be able to actually emulate the functionality of the app, right? That's very possible. Um, so So the early steps in a product development sequence, right? When you get to that prototyping type, which is what I was telling you, is sometimes you have to do a wireframe, right? And I'm going to walk us through what the wireframe, especially as defined in this course, right? What a wireframe is, what a mockup is, and what a prototype is. So when we are thinking of a wireframe, right, we are literally thinking of a blueprint or the schematic of the project or the model. So I'm thinking of some kind of low fidelity representation of the final product where you're literally just doing your drawings, right? To be able to say, okay, this is what this would look like. And then you use arrows to show the flow and all of that, right? Usually it's very high level. Notice it uses black, white, and gray colors. There's no color at this time. It's boring. You can do it by hand or digitally where you're, for example, using Surface, Microsoft Surface to draw on your, but the point being, this is not complicated. So there's also no interactivity between the user. If you call the user, right, there's no interactivity between the user and the app you have created at this point. So it's just paperwork. And eventually I'm going to include a link of a video where someone actually did wireframing for an app. Possibly if we have time, I'm going to have us see that video too. Then when you go to mockup, right, now you have just gone beyond paper and you started creating things like 3D. If you were creating something as like 3D models of what you're trying to do, right? But for the specific case of an app, like in our case, right, you are going a step ahead of wireframes where you're beginning to use real buttons, headers, and some of those buttons and headers and all of visual imagery that you see with apps, particularly for iOS. There's actually a library of those in Apple gives you a library of those. You can see some of those buttons and everything. They're available for use in such a way that you can actually use them for your prototypes. It will become like kind of really very realistic, so you're adding elements of realism. So you're using the rich colors, the designs, if there are topographies, styles, your color theme, you know and then there's some level of interactivity when you're using the mock-ups. But beyond that, right, we now talk about the prototype. The prototype is even more realistic than your mock-up, right? Now it's highly interactive, there's high interactivity, there's high fidelity, and when I talk about fidelity, we are talking about that at this point there's a almost an exact correspondence with the real product you're trying to create. In some cases, for some of these, there are some cases there you actually have people create like the user interface, and things like that, to be able to show some functionality. It depends on where you are, but your prototype could still just be what you do on keynotes, right? But the point is there's a lot of interactivity where you click the links, it takes you to all the pages, it does everything you want it to do. It might not have um you know what you call the engine, the data engine that cranks out the data and does all of that, but it's very realistic. At least it's something, when you see it, you'll be like, oh my god, this is exactly what I wanted. Or no, heck no, this is not what I want. So it's that progression where you move from mock-up to prototype. So doesn't have to contain every single screen of functionality. That's one of those things. So it delivers the minimum requirements of the app. So that's for how you go about. Again, if you have the time, I would highly recommend you look up one of the design thinking courses, right? Or at the very minimum, go to YouTube. There's a lot of work that's been done in the area of design thinking. But irrespective of what you do, right? A workshop, and I wish we could do one of those workshops. Usually is a whole day workshop where you pick up a problem and you go through the design thinking process, work as a group, and it's amazing. At the end of the day, you actually end up with a product, you know, and that is exactly what a lot of companies do, excuse me, in their process of developing products. And we're not just talking about app. You see all of these fantastic products you see in the market, most of them use the design thinking process. So that would be me for this. And again, I want to welcome any questions you have at this time. Um, Eventually, we're going to go on a break at some point, and then we'll come back and try to see a practical use of Keynote, for example, to develop a prototype. So any questions? Questions, contributions, all of that is welcome. Okay, if there's none,